Good morning, everyone, or afternoon, depending on where in the world you're from. We've got quite a lot of attendees today from all different parts of the globe, so welcome everybody. So thank you for joining this joint CyberArk and Turnkey webinar to discuss the results of our survey on SAP and privileged access management that was carried out throughout May. So thank you very much for completing that. Today's format is in a panel style format, and I'm your host for the session, Chris Boyle. So I'm the Identity and Access Management Director for Turnkey. I've been involved in Identity and Access Management for about 20 years, doing all things IAM related, and we've been working with CyberArk for many years, delivering sort of large scale projects. So I'll be the host for today, and joining me is David Higgins, who's the director from CyberArk, and we've got Tom Venables, who's director of our cyber application security practice. But I'll let them introduce themselves a little bit better than me. So David, do you want to give a brief introduction?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Chris. So yeah, David Higgins, I'm a technical director at CyberArk. Been with the company for just coming up to 11 years now, and obviously been very much focusing on all things privileged access. So really looking forward to kind of seeing the results from today and kind of discussing the implications and what it kind of is showing in terms of trends, etc.
Fantastic. Thank you, David. Tom, do you want to give a brief introduction?
Yeah, good morning, everyone. Thanks, Chris. And I'm Tom Venables, Practice Director for our Application Cybersecurity practice, which means a lot of the SAP work that we pick up in terms of implementations and management of accounts flows through me. And like David, I'm keen to break down the results, discuss a little bit about what it means for SAP customers specifically, and how that relates to the wider management of privileged accounts across the estate.
Cool. Thanks, guys. Just a quick, quick housekeeping before we get kicked off. Just to let everybody know that this session is being recorded, and it will be available later and sent out for everybody to replay on demand. And if you do have any questions, there will be a Q&A section at the end. If you can put questions in the chat window, and we will try to get to them all at the end. If we don't manage to get to them all, we will follow up afterwards directly. Cool. So let's get started. So first of all, again, just a big thank you for everybody who responded to the survey. As you can see, we had an excellent amount of responses. So we had over 125 plus responses across many different sectors. We had senior stakeholders from throughout the business who responded, and the size of the companies were medium to large size companies. So yeah, much appreciated on that, and we've actually collated some really good results and findings, which we'll discuss in shortly. Just before we do that, though, what I wanted to do was just talk a little bit about what privilege means, and just some terminology here, because I specifically know that when me and Tom have conversations around privilege, if he puts his SAP hat on, we might be having different conversations about slightly different things, but using the same terminology. So from a non-SAP identity and access management perspective, when we talk about privilege, what we talk about is any access for kind of what you would normally typically find that your IT administrators look after. So these are your kind of your root access accounts on Linux, or your server administrator accounts on Windows. But it could mean anything. If you access a network firewall, even if your router at home, for example, that would require an administrative password. So all of these types of accounts are what we would typically define as privilege. And when you apply that to all of the different applications across your entire estate, they would have, you've got cloud applications, on-premise applications. All of those have got, administrative accounts, or keys to the kingdom, as it were. So if anybody was to get hold of the username and password for them, they could, cause damage, do malicious things, exfiltrate data, that type of thing. But I guess it'd be good, Tom, if you could just give a bit of a description of what privilege means within the SAP world.
Yeah, it's largely the same, Chris, but we think of it slightly differently within the application layer. Just within the SAP applications themselves, there's a load of standard privileged accounts that are delivered, like SAP Star and DDIG, which are used to configure the systems. But we also have online support IDs, so like SAP OSS accounts, which are provided broad privileges. But I also wanted to make sure that we include the database admins, the root users of the infrastructure and the operating systems that are actually running these servers. We also extend it to IT and business super users, so the ability to do things like open posting periods or open the client for changes, which bypasses a lot of controls. We've got technical system users scattered throughout the estate that are used for RFC connectivity or for scheduling of background jobs that carry specific elevated privileges within there. And then we also have the access privileges just within the usual role in user administration, sort of classic security model that extends from everything from master data controlling type access through the transactional super users who can mass process journals, for example, and stick several million quid's worth of journals through in a few seconds. Extended to the RFC privileges, the HTTP sort of privileges, and then the standard stuff that we all know about, like SAPL, which is your default GOT mode, as well as some of the things like direct program and table access that bypass your standard authorization concepts. It's quite a broad estate, but yeah, in terms of privileged account management, it's the same principles, just applied a little bit more broadly.
Yeah, absolutely. And to that effect as well, in the kind of the wider IAM context as well, we include things like social media credentials, for organizations and things like that. So although it is predominantly IT administrative based, there are lots of accounts out there that that are used by the business. That I've got those high levels of privilege that just need that extra level of protection. I just thought it'd be good to kind of set the terminology for people within the audience who are with different parts of the business.
Mm-hmm.
A couple of statistics that I found really interesting when dealing with privileged access management when I kind of we were starting on the journey many years ago, is that from an organizational perspective, and this statistic looks quite amazing the first time you see it, is that if you have a company of 10,000 employees, then they often refer to it as the 3-to-1 ratio, whereby you actually have probably about 30,000 accounts of a privileged nature. And you think, how can that be possible? Well, if you think about, not only do all of your servers have privileged accounts, all of your applications, but every laptop that you have, all of your devices that people use on a day-to-day basis, all of those devices, all of those things within the organization, that have access to systems and data, all require some level of management, and therefore they will have administrative accounts. So it's actually quite a higher number than most people actually perceive. And according to Forrester, 80% of breaches that are reported have some form of privileged access that is used to actually cause that breach itself. So there is there's a huge amount of potential for organizations to there's a whole lot of privileged accounts that do need managing. Cool. So
Chris, just there's a message in chat saying that your audio is coming through quite low compared to mine. Is there any way you could turn your microphone up a little? Sorry.
I can try. Let me just.
Sorry to cut you off there. Whilst you're doing that, I would encourage anybody attending, if you have any questions, we're trying to make some space at the end of this session to address those. We'll answer as many as we can within the webinar, but please do post them in the Q&A section. And if we don't get to you live, then we'll ensure to follow up and get you a response.
I'm just checking, is that any better, or is that?
I'll wait to hear from either Dirk or Peter in the chat.
Yeah, I could try using a different one, but I'm not sure if that sounds Better or worse?
That's much better now.
That's much better, is it? Okay. Cool. No problem. Excellent. Right. Well, on to the actual results of the survey. So the first question that was asked is, do you have full visibility of privileged accounts across your estate? And according to the results, so 78% of respondents do not have full visibility across their SAP estate. And so I guess, Tom, is that something that you quite often see?
Yeah, I think this speaks to how we deal with security in SAP. We largely focus on the application layer. And I think the key here is the full visibility piece. I think we know our application super users, as the respondents have said. So we create firefighter IDs. We know who our IT admins are and things like that within the application. But we may not know the root accounts of the operating systems and the servers. We might not know the database. And definitely governance over third-party access, making sure that they're not sharing credentials or using anonymized access is still a challenge for a lot of SAP customers.
Yeah, and I think it's not just SAP as well. I mean, David, if you take that to the wider estate, I think that's that's reflective of the enterprise in general.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a really interesting result and statistic. I think exactly as Tom said, I think when we look at the application layer, we've got a pretty good view. The layer that's often overlooked is, well, what does that application actually sit on and what's got the admin rights under the covers, right? So the root level accounts in the operating system, the admin level accounts in the databases. And that's always a complex one, especially as also Tom mentioned, right? If you've got third-party support, you're outsourcing any of this to a third-party service provider, that becomes even more complicated. What accounts are they using? How is that account provisioned? How's it removed when it's not needed, right? And sadly, that's not necessarily always done. And I'd hook this back into the statistic you showed on the previous slide, right? 80% of breaches involve privileged credentials, and there's a pretty good reason why attackers go there, right? Because the level of access. If I get hold of a domain admin account and you've got applications running on your Windows environment, well, I can leverage that compromised domain admin to jump around and get to various different places, right? So I think this is pretty reflective of what we see when we speak to other organizations.
Yeah, I think as well, one of the things I noticed, especially around the SAP estate, is in the IAM world, and for most applications, you would typically have 3 environments: dev, UAT, SIT, and then a prod and DR. But in the SAP world, that's actually compounded, because you have 7, 8 perhaps environments of SAP with multiple instances across each, all with perhaps some form of production, well, some of them at least with some form of production data in there as well. So again, it's managing those accounts across the entire estate, including non-production as well.
Absolutely, and I think it comes down to a problem of identifying those accounts quite a lot of the time. So the key piece here being visibility. You have good control over your application layer, but once you get into the weeds of the infrastructure, it can be difficult to identify, and especially as we say, when that's an outsourced function, in a data center that's several hundred miles remote from you that you're not owning. There are ways that you can identify these, and I do encourage everybody to maintain a record of their super user accounts so that they can govern them better.
Yeah, absolutely. Most people, when we're working with different companies and different types of clients, they will record them in different ways, and there are tools to help you do that. It might be in a CMDB, it might be in we've seen people just use spreadsheets. We've seen people not record them if they're not as part of like regulatory controls like SOX and things like that. So, but CyberArk do have a discovery tool, so they have a couple of tools in that area. I don't know if you want to talk about DNA or SkyArk, David.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm glad you mentioned it, because it's always very CyberArk. You have a vendor on the session, right? And the vendor's always going to plug a product. But the great thing about these 2 products that you mentioned is actually that they're free to leverage. So DNA discovery and audit is a tool that will actually go out and scan your infrastructure, scan the environment, and find out where the privileged accounts are, why they're privileged. Are they sitting in a group, sudo or permissions, that kind of thing, when they were last used, when the password was last changed. And it's amazing how many times we run that and we find, you know, accounts with passwords that are hundreds, if not sometimes thousands of days old, because there's operational challenges with managing those accounts. SkyArk is the other tool that you mentioned, and that will help discover privileges that exist in the cloud. You know, as we embrace cloud, we sign up to infrastructure platform as a service, more admin layers are kind of created. And I'd like to just take a nod as well to a message that we got sent by one of the attendees that said it's a challenge, right, to do a deep dive review of all these accounts that exist and, you know, to get kind of visibility of them all. And agreed, it is a challenge, as Chris pointed out, like 1 to 3 accounts, if not more, privileged to individuals in your business. It's difficult to kind of keep track and monitor all those. What I would say is visibility is important. And then the next thing to do is kind of identify that when you saw that previous slide that Chris showed, all the different types of privileged accounts, some of those are going to pose a bigger risk to you as an organization than others if you kind of consider them going into the hands of an attacker. So we need to get visibility of all of them. It isn't straightforward, hence discovery tools as mentioned. But you also need to consider which ones are going to pose a bigger risk, bigger impact to our business if, you know, they are compromised and leveraged by a malicious actor.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it is scary to think that, you know, you have to manage 10,000 users and it's difficult enough for business users, and then you think, oh, I've got 30,000 privileged users now to manage as well. So yeah, definitely some form of tooling is definitely recommended, especially for, you know, as we see more and more breaches happening, you know, more and more in the news now. You know, I've been having to report everything through GDPR. Well, it's definitely something that, you know, worth looking into. Yeah, so onto the second question, which is how often do you change admin user passwords? So I think this is a kind of a really interesting finding, and just anecdotally, we worked with a client previously, a global client. They had, I think it was so 36,000 users across 60 countries, and they had quite a large estate, both Windows and Linux, and actually they did an exercise where they were, just before they looked at a PAM solution, but they did an exercise where they had to change their administration, their admin passwords across their entire estate. It was mandated. It was the result of an incident, and they basically said they needed to change all their passwords, didn't know how the attacker had got in, etc. And it took them 10,000 man hours to change their entire estate's privileged credentials across it, because it's not only, you know, the admin users and the root users, the typical ones as well, but those might then have you know, there might be services running off the back of them and things like that. So it actually becomes a lot more difficult. So so the results from this is quite interesting, because you know, when we talk about admin user passwords, again, I think this is more in the context of the SAP estate. And I guess, Tom, I'll come to you again, just to kind of analyse this the response here. And is this what we typically see from an SAP perspective? And is that down to regulations that we typically see that level of change happening?
Well, I was quite encouraged by the amount that are doing it regularly. You know, over 70% doing it at least 4 times a year. It is still. I'd like to see some more deep dive into this, if I'm honest, to see whether that's an automated process, whether it's governed through tooling, or whether it is a manual process. But at least people are thinking about it. I think the not sures and the we don'ts is a little concerning. It speaks to a lack of visibility there. But yeah, if you're operating any sort of ITGC within a compliance framework, you should be gaining control over the privileged accounts at both the application and the supporting infrastructure layers. You know, we have to fill out a lot of these security questionnaires where how often do you reset your admin passwords is one of the first questions on there. So there is definitely a compliance requirement driving this as well.
Yeah, yeah. I guess, David, from a wider wider estate perspective, how do you see it working with, you know, I guess, many clients across the globe?
Yeah, so as Tom mentioned, it's not a case of whether we have to do, if we have to do it, is very much that we have to do it. And it's either because of compliance regulation demands this, or actually security demands it, right? Because, you know, unmanaged admin accounts are easy pickings for an attacker. The challenge then comes to be, you've got two options to do this. You can do this automatically and use tooling to do it and help, you know, automatically recycle these accounts, or you can do it manually. As you mentioned, Chris, that can be hugely intensive from a man-hours perspective. And then you'll probably discover that probably 5% of those are incorrectly logged, because as people were manually typing them in, they've recorded them wrong, right? You know, how many times do we incorrectly log into a website, right, with our password? Imagine then trying to store a password you've set, but maybe it hasn't been set properly. So manual password rotation always has some operational challenges to it, for sure. But the problem, of course, as you mentioned, is the scope of this. And then you look at things like service accounts, just in the Windows environment alone, offers complexity. You change your password, we then have to update services. Do they need to be restarted? And that's obviously where tooling steps into the mix, right? Because that's just something you can't do manually. It becomes too much of a burden.
Yeah, and I think again, one of the biggest sort of first challenges to this is identifying and prioritizing those admin passwords. So which, you know, we've already said there's absolutely going to be thousands of them across the estate, but is, you know, what's more important? Is it going to be, you know, the admin credentials over the database to your financial systems, or is it going to be the, you know, the local user admin on someone's you know, laptop or phone? Well, of course it's going to be the financial system, but then there's everything in between those, you know, those two levels. So again, identifying first is quite a big task, and, you know, there are tools out there that, like we talked about, that can do that. But the prioritization is quite a big task in itself, and then coming up with a plan of, you know, how we're gonna manage that. But I mean, you know, like I say, from the statistic there, it's good to see, as Tom says, you know, that people are thinking about this, and you know, and it is happening. Happening more often than I expected. So, well done everybody who's in the 36% and actually in the 35%. So, still fantastic.
I think the only thing I'd add as well is, you know, you can reduce this burden massively if you also enhance these controls with, you know, single sign-on solutions and strong multi-factor authentication to ensure that you've got putting protections over that. You can reduce your admin burden massively.
Completely agreed. You know, if for those in the quarterly, as you say, it's very good hygiene, but if there's password disclosure happening, you know, and it's not single sign, it's not passwordless, the workflow for the access, then you've got a credential out in the wild, right, for potentially 3 months there.
Yeah, and I think you've seen on a totally kind of different topic, but, you know, where attackers now, what they're doing is they, you know, if they do gain access to a particular system, I think, Tom, you'd mentioned this before, that they're letting themselves in, creating themselves additional accounts, patching the system, and you know, so that the systems can't get used again. So they, you know, they are using many sort of complex techniques to do that, and, you know, hiding their trail, as it were. So yeah, as you say, I think
that actually speaks to a comment that we've had from John in the chat as well, who said, how significant is the risk of passwords being the same across non-production environments? Can we talk to the risk there? They understand the production risk. What I'd say is, certainly within an SAP estate, there's RFC connections at an application layer level that you can use to traverse and execute privileges there. You can do remote operating system or SQL calls to connected systems. And there's quite a significant risk of system traversal when people breach an account. And if passwords are the same across non-production accounts, then it's a lot easier for these attackers to go, well, it was admin 123 on non-prod on the QA system. Let's try it on the dev. And then they've got the keys to the kingdom. So I think strong password controls across your whole estate are essential.
Yeah, and I'm sure David can talk about sort of lateral movement and things like that, but just wanted to say that it all depends on what's in those those non-production systems, because if you've got prod or prod-like data in there, you know, it's easier to get into the non-prod systems, and absolutely the risk is the same as prod, because ultimately what they're after is data, and, you know, if they can exfiltrate that, then they've got what you want from a non-prod system. But yeah, David, you know, the lateral movement type stuff, that's one of the key attack vectors, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's, you know, from an analogy perspective, very similar to what Tom was suggesting there was with SAP, right? It's those vectors exist in the broader IT environment, right? And, you know, I'll take the example to organizations in OT side, right? So, you know, industrial control systems, and they'll always say our environment is completely isolated, air gap, there's no way in between. And then they'll execute a red team exercise and find out the established trust between various domains. And actually that allowed the red team to traverse through and get to that highly sensitive environment. We see it all the time. The other thing to kind of mention with this question as well about, you know, non-prod and prod, you've also got to think about developers putting credentials into code. And if that doesn't change as the code's committed to production, you know, you're kind of importing insecurities into your production state, right? And you'll find a password sitting in a piece of code that's easily extractable by a would-be attacker.
I've seen username and password commented out in HTML code on a website that you can, you know, F12 it and see credentials. So developer practices need to improve across the board, I think.
Yeah. And you know, having something that kind of sits in between that sort of a DevOps model that allows you to not only, you know, change passwords as people have logged in themselves, but also as systems have logged in. So, you know, if there is that system-to-system communication, then having, you know, something like CyberArk that sits in between those systems that can change the password and allocate the password to help with that as well. So that, you know, if a developer does hard code a password, well, we can change that immediately without any loss of service. Cool. So on to question 3, if my mouse will work. Excellent. Yeah. So how do you manage super user accounts in your SAP applications? So again, there's we have people out there with enterprise level PAM tooling, which is fantastic. Again, with firefight processes as well. I'd be interested to hear any kind of stories around, you know, where PAM tooling has been integrated with the SAP tooling as well, because I think, you know, you get the kind of the best of the both worlds there, where you get the full kind of audit reporting that you can provide the auditors, but also you get the transaction level stuff through firefighting. But I'll let Tom talk a little bit more around that. But yeah, and then there's no formal process for super user accounts as well. So some interesting statistics there. Tom, I'll go to you first.
Yeah, I'd echo what you said, Chris. I think the integration with the enterprise level is something that I'd like to encourage more and more SAP customers to do. We like to think that SAP is a special case, and in some ways, you know, it's guarding your crown jewels, and it has its own ways of doing things that aren't necessarily the same. But with something like privileged account management, there's no reason that we should be any different to the rest of the IT estate, and there are good controls in place across the estate that we can adopt. Manual firefighter processes are time-consuming, can be error-prone, and difficult to demonstrate to auditors. So there's a cost implication of operating those, but it's better than no process at all. The no formal process is a little bit concerning. You know, you shouldn't be handing people the keys to the kingdom without some form of governance. You know, you need an approval, you need a review. You've got to identify that the use of those accounts, especially in third-party support scenarios. I mean, I don't like having change access to production systems on customers that I support, because I don't want any fingers pointed at me that says, you changed this. I'd much rather go through an approved process where I can prove exactly what I did and that I requested the access that I needed to support that particular incident or change or whatever it was.
Yeah. And I think, you know, when you have the kind of a PAM tooling that kind of sits in front of it, so you know, basically the PAM tool will sit between the user and an SAP and the firefighter account, etc. So again, what you're doing is not only improving security by the PAM tool being able to manage the passwords, rotate the passwords, you know, or manage that password for you, but you're actually making a much better user experience as well, because the user can, either through ServiceNow or whatever ITSM tool that you use, or through the PAM tool itself, you know, they can request access, it can log tickets, and they can provide the session into SAP, while all of that's recorded for future and audit use, etc. So actually, you're getting a much better user experience, much improved security, and it's one of those things where no one really notices that it's happening. It just makes it nice and easy, but the actual security is much higher, which then reduces your risk. I don't know, David, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, in complete agreement. I think you say first positive to see the 12% using enterprise level PAM tooling. I'm hoping that 12% is all CyberArk, of course, but I'm very biased there, right? What I think what's interesting about this question and interesting about the results is, I think in some industries historically PAM's been deployed as a compliance reaction and focused on infrastructure within certain compliant areas, PCI, SOX, whatever it may be. And the bridge hasn't necessarily been, so the gap hasn't necessarily been bridged between, well, actually, if we look into our business critical applications and think about this from a resiliency perspective, are we also securing the admin accounts into that with our PAM capability? Because it allows us then to implement consistent controls, consistent views, and simplified auditing, once the auditors come knocking on the door.
Cool. Cheers, David. Absolutely. So question 4. So do you extend the PAM accounts to the database operating system and servers, as well as for the application? So again, I think massively encouraging here that the answer is yes, which is fantastic. And I think from a wider IAM perspective, that's absolutely what we're looking at. We're looking across the entire estate, database, server, OS, and what Tom was talking about earlier. But I don't know, guys, have you got any comments on this one?
Not really much to say on this one. I agree with you. It's very encouraging. I think the trend needs to continue. We need to get those no's down a little bit lower. But yeah, it's good to see that our respondents at least understand this, and they're extending, not just the application level controls, but thinking about all of the risk to their SAP estate, and closing that gap between the SAP application owner and the CISO, as I think of it.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I think we had another question come into the chat, which links onto this as well, which about the additional risk between SAP and non-SAP teams, right? So we're going to run this on infrastructure. It's got a database. We need DBAs to help. We need infrastructure support to help with that. And so absolutely there's risk of cost associated with our access. So this is really encouraging to see. What I'd also, kind of add on to that is that strive. I think when you think about those different teams that need access to the underlying environment, is striving towards least privilege as well. So, a DBA connecting in shouldn't be connecting in as root, should be connecting in with the relevant permissions he or she needs to do their role. And that's kind of maturity processes that we see within PAM, just to make sure that they get the access they need, nothing more, and we don't see, outages due to accidental, mistakes and because of excessive permissions, so on and so forth.
Yeah. I was good. Oh,
you go, Chris.
I was just going to say that it kind of that sort of thing. There's quite a lot of administration overhead with that. So when you do kind of have an automated tooling, actually then you can start to think about implementing the least privilege. It takes less effort because the automated provisioning of that access is much easier. But sorry, Tom, I interrupted.
Sorry, just to pick up on David's point there about the non-SAP teams and their access to data, responding to John's question. That is still a risk to you. That data can be exfiltrated. If you're talking about ransomware attacks, those backup processes that you've described, John, are essential in service recovery from ransomware. So you need additional controls in that space. And the example of the Walmart data breach, which was a security administrator exfiltrating data to a third party for review and uploaded a copy of it to the dark web. So you've got to keep an eye on who's doing what with your data and take quite a data-centric approach to manage that risk.
And that's where, some of the monitoring functionality comes in, because you can record rather than having two sets of eyes on people doing tasks and that, like you can put record sessions and things like that, which can then, if there is a breach, at least you can play it back to see who's done what in a fully searchable manner. But just the last thing on this, I think we should run this this questionnaire again and see if we can get that 83% up next year, and see if we can improve on that. That's quite a good number of yeses, which is good.
Yeah.
Cool. So yeah, all things cloud. So do you extend PAM solutions to govern access to super user accounts in the cloud? So again, very encouraging that whether it's a PAM solution or whether it's just PAM controls, I guess, that actually people are thinking about managing the cloud-based platforms as well, with a lot of things moving towards that. Now, I guess the question here is, is that how much of that is SAP related, and is that or is that from the wider business? But yeah, I mean, I guess I'll go to Tom first on this one to give your thoughts.
Well, as we know, a lot of customers at the moment are undertaking their digital transformations and cloud migration. A lot of that driven by the sort of S4 estates and the adoption of success factors. Those kind of cloud solutions are cost effective to spin up. They're still supporting the business effectively. I think the migration to cloud has been cautious, but is accelerating rapidly. And I think that caution is borne out by the statistic here. People have really thought about, okay, we're taking our data out of our data center now. It's no longer within our four walls. So let's really think about the super user access there. Let's really take that controls-based approach to how we're going to provision access to these systems. So it's good to have it forefront. And I think that trend needs to continue.
When everyone needs to manage their corporate Twitter account, don't they? Yeah, don't want that to get breached.
Absolutely.
David, do you have any?
Yeah, it's really encouraging to see. I think, if you probably ran this question a couple of years ago, the statistic wouldn't have been much lower. I don't think initially there was, that realization that, as we sign up to SaaS, infrastructure, platform as a service, whatever it is as a service, there is new administrative layers created straight away. It's a bit like when we virtualized many years ago, right? You created a new admin layer altogether, right? The hypervisor account that could, of course, shut down all the VMs. You've got the same thing within the cloud estate, and it's a hugely powerful account, provides a lot of agility and elasticity, but again, poses a lot of risk, and we need to be aware of that. And I completely agree with Tom. We're seeing that acceleration now of cloud adoption, people more comfortable with the shared responsibility model that they get from their cloud providers. But we have a shared responsibility model, right? Which is, they protect the back end. We've got to look after the front end, and there's admin level access with that needs to be protected.
Yeah, you've got to extend that controls estate to your vendors as well. So where you're heavily regulated, somebody in the chat, I think it's John again, has mentioned Sarbanes-Oxley. So where you've got financially audited systems that need to be a proven system of record for shareholder accounts and valuations, etc. You've got to do your diligence on the vendors. You've got to get their SOC reports. You've got to be able to provide that evidence that the system integrity is not being impacted by the vendors themselves.
Yeah, like you said, it definitely is. It's third parties and even the cloud providers themselves. So there was the Cloud Hopper incident before, where it was actually the excuse me, the cloud provider themselves that have been breached, and then they've got access to their tenants' data, if you like. So they got access to their clients' data through backdoor. So yeah, it really is, like I say, an additional layer, something else that you have to monitor and control. And yeah, again, another layer of administrative overhead that has to be taken care of.
Yeah, I think it's informed by the answer to the next question as well, which is, do you monitor and control the use of super user accounts on third parties? I think that needs to extend to the vendors as well. So I think these two pretty closely linked.
Yeah, absolutely. And, a lot of people do outsource functions now within the organisation, and it's perhaps different third parties rather than having sort of single vendor. So and then it's how are they managing their access to the controls? Are you giving each person individual accounts? Are they sharing passwords? That type of thing. So there's lots of this that we see going on.
Yeah, and I think what I pick up from this one is that the use of tool-based controls suddenly jumps. So clearly people are more concerned about these users that they don't control and can't necessarily fire immediately. And it's good to see that there's some automation and some consistency of control with less room for error.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think this can be a huge operational overhead securing the third-party access. Join and move a lever process is difficult enough for our own employees, let alone third parties who need access to our environment. So hugely encouraging to see that tool-based approach, because that's going to help drive accountability. That's going to help drive some of the manual process around JML down for sure around the third parties. And it's definitely, if you're not doing anything, it's worth having, in fact, sorry, to go back to the tool-based comment, that's again hugely encouraging. A lot of the third parties in their agreements will say, yep, we're managing our admin level access. And then when you actually inquire as to what they're doing as well, we've got a spreadsheet, right? And we're putting the admin passwords in a spreadsheet, and there's a password on the spreadsheet. And for them, that's them ticking their box, right? That they've secured admin level access. So it's always worth, if a third party is saying they are doing it, just doing a little bit of auditing and validating what that is, because it may not match up to your own standards.
Yeah, absolutely. And as well, when you think about tool-based controls, what we tend to see as well is where you don't have kind of an enterprise level PAM solution in place, that tool-based controls actually form multiple tools across multiple different applications as well. So then there's the overhead of managing them as well, plus what the third parties are doing, so it's it can become very complex, and you have lots of different processes that you have to manage as well. And then what we see is that can then be, so I guess the takeaway from this one is to, if you're thinking about managing super user accounts across your estate, when you're looking at tools, perhaps think not just within the confines of the the area that you're in, but think of it more of a strategic level, and think the effort that could be spent on managing accounts across a particular application. That effort could be put into developing a solution that could be used more strategically across multiple applications, and then rolled out in a kind of a BAU process. Which brings us on nicely to password vaulting, and a lot of respondents do use some form of password vaulting, quite a lot actually, at 7%. So again, that's great to see. And I guess again, it'd be interesting to I think if we could have expanded this out to say what kind of password vaulting technology do people use. That would be an interesting response as well, because we do see quite a lot of tactical solutions in place. It could be anything from LastPass, down to just using like Google Chrome and things like that, or just things to store administrative passwords in. But it is good to see that some form of password vaulting is being used. David, do you want to talk a little bit about some of the benefits of having a more kind of enterprise-wide password vault?
Yeah, absolutely. So firstly, as you say, very encouraging to see. As I mentioned in the intro, it's been at CyberArk 11 years. As you could probably tell from the photo we showed, I've changed a lot because lockdown's been difficult, right? But 11 years ago, people were doing things really manually, right? Passwords in envelopes and spreadsheets. So this is a step in the right direction for sure. As you say, if we could scratch under the surface, that would be interesting, because you want to make sure that any kind of vaulting capability you're doing is providing you with accountability and auditing, right? If I put a credential in the vault, do I know who's retrieved it and when? Do I know, can I tie activity down to that individual? Because that then moves into the next thing. If I'm not rotating credentials and I'm just storing them statically, yes, it's better than nothing. But once that password's been retrieved and it's out there, it can be shared, it can be compromised. And if we're not just doing the basics of regular credential rotation as part of that password vault capability, we're going to be leaving ourselves a little bit exposed there. So the things like KeePass, LastPass, again, step in the right direction. but I think when we talk about some of those critical accounts that you highlighted at the beginning of this session, the controls need to be more mature, I would say, on those processes, because it's not enough just to statically store these and get that accountability as mentioned.
Yeah. I think I've nothing really to add. I think the maturity of the password vault is the key here. If it is just a repository, as you say, it's better than just storing them in a post-it note on your desk or a notepad file on your desktop. But yeah, actually automating the controls here is where you'll get your most risk reduction. We've had a comment from John. How much of a risk is quantum computing to passwords? Is it all hype? At the moment, it's hype, but that could all change. What I would say is you don't need quantum computing to break an 8-character password anymore. The standards that we set of 8 characters and special characters, etc., mean that it takes longer to crack passwords, but it's not impossible. There's some interesting infographics online that will show you how long it takes to brute force a password, even with standard technology today. But when quantum computing comes in, we won't be using passwords anymore. We'll be biometrically secured. There'll be distributed ledgers to authenticate, and we'll use the quantum computing to enforce new forms of encryption. So I wouldn't worry too much about it at the moment. I think some of the respondents in the survey show that we still need to get the basics right before we worry about what's a few years down the road.
And yeah, sales of post-it notes will go down dramatically, I think, then. So people are writing stuff down and sticking it to the monitors. Cool. Sorry, I'm just aware of time. But yeah, so how effectively would you say you managed privileged accounts overall? So it's an interesting response. Very effectively. So there's a level of confidence in the respondents, which is really good. Yeah, I think somewhat effectively. Again, I would have expected to kind of see that skewed a little bit less, but it's good from an assurance perspective that people are confident in that. I guess one of the things that we obviously recommend working with you all is that with sort of with that level of confidence, it'd be good to kind of just run the scanning tool on the network and just see if that's see how effective those are. And it's just from a risk management perspective, like it's good to actually if you are confident in how effective you manage accounts, it's good to back that up with data from your own network as well. So again, would highly recommend doing a kind of a scan.
Yeah, I completely agree. I'd like to see whether that level of confidence is over the application layer. I mean, we've got quite a few SAP respondents in the survey who are probably doing a great job of securing the application because they've had that attention on there. But if their wider IT infrastructure is wide open, and whether they're aware of that or not, that would be interesting to inform. And I think something like a discovery piece to identify what they are would help to justify that confidence.
Completely agree. It's a terrible expression to use, but you only know what you know, right? And therefore you can only comment on what you know. And as you say, that's where the discovery tools can come in very helpful to actually find out orphaned accounts and things that are slipped through the gaps, right, that still exist and actually still represent risk.
Perfect. Thanks, guys. And then the last question was around what level of view automated controls around privileged accounts. So highly automated controls have 52%, and then somewhat automated, but some gaps. I think that's still quite a high number. 87% have got some automated controls around there. It's great that that's happening. I think otherwise it becomes unmanageable across the estate if you don't have some level of automated controls. I guess again it would just be, if we did this again next year, let's see that bar go a little bit higher and perhaps get a little bit more detail around how that it's being managed. But yeah, I mean, David, I guess a quick question from the clients that that do implement CyberArk technology, do they tend to implement that across their entire estate, or integrate with any other tools? What do you kind of see in the market?
Yeah, a bit of a mixture for sure. The overall objective typically of security is to implement those controls as consistently as possible. And I say as possible, right? There are situations where technology and process perhaps means we can't, rotate a credential after every time it's been used, as an example. But it's, I'd say it's mixture as well. The other thing to think about this around automating controls of privilege account, firstly, hugely important, absolutely, to make sure it's effective, right? We want to make sure things are being rotated after use, as an example, automation of reviews, that kind of thing. But then if you think about, we've probably mainly, certainly I have mainly talked about privileged access from an interactive point of view, a human user ascertaining privilege. You've got to remember as well that there's a whole environment of automated privileged access taking place, scripts, code, DevOps, robotic process automation as well, that kind of thing, which is where we're handing credentials to autonomous systems. So to your question, Chris, do we see integrations and leveraging the things that's also another angle that would see that automation coming into the mix here around privileged accounts. This process, this service, this script, whatever it is, wants to use a privileged account, make sure it's automatically delivered, but make sure that's securely done, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, RPA is a new challenge for us, and I'm getting the question a lot more from customers saying, what do we do about our bot accounts? Like, you need to treat them exactly the same as you would any other user, if not with a little bit more control over minimum access privileges and all the good stuff that you've been doing for years. Make sure that the keys to those kingdoms are tightly controlled. We do have another question from John, but I think we've only got one slide left, haven't we, Chris?
And this is the last question, and then it was onto the question slide. So let's go for it.
Yeah. So before we answer John's question, I did just want to, if you click on twice, Chris, we do have a cybersecurity forum that we're hosting at the beginning of July, where we'll dive into some of these topics and extending cyber controls for SAP beyond the application layer. So there'll be some good speakers on that and some interesting sessions to help you take your defense of SAP to the next level. With that little piece of admin out of the way, we've got a little bit of time left to pick up some questions. And John has asked, can we talk about the risks of a single vendor managing or having access to most of the infrastructure or applications? It depends on the vendor, I suppose. But that's a very consulting answer. I think some of the stuff that we've talked about today, the controls that we've talked about demonstrating, if you're going to provide such trust into a vendor, make sure that they're demonstrating the same level of care that you would, first and foremost, and ideally better than what you might be doing yourself. So you're looking for good quality SOC operations. You're looking for good quality processes around what they do with password management for their accounts. Have they provided you with a documented list of who all their users are? Are they ensuring that they're not using generic accounts and that they reset the passwords for the really privileged users on a regular basis? Are they employing automated tooling to govern that? So everything that we've talked about would be indicators that they're taking your security seriously. I don't think it's a bigger risk than necessarily insourcing it, as long as you do your diligence and you make sure their processes are effective.
Yeah, I think it, how your controls are set up as well. So if you used a product like CyberArk, for example, and that would allow people to gain access to servers and the infrastructure and everything that they need to do their role, but they would never actually see a username and a password. Sorry, they'd see a username, but they would never see a password. So everything kind of single sign-on. And actually, then because that's still potentially hosted by yourselves, you still maintain control of that. So again, when if you then came to switch suppliers, you don't have to then move a lot of it's not the handover process, is just simply setting up some new accounts in a similar manner to the ones that already exist, and all of the control is out of their hands, if that makes sense. So again, with automation, it all has to be around good processes, but David, I'll let you talk a little bit more about that. I'm sure you can.
That's a really good point, Chris, you made there, right? So it's worth reviewing a lot of this comes down to contractual agreements as well, what you can and can't do. But if you can secure and manage the way that they gain access, it makes it much easier that you're less hooked into that single supplier, right? So as you mentioned, if you want to change, if you're controlling the way they get in, you just say, well, you no longer have access to this service, and we now make this available to our new supplier, right? Of course, you know, risks of a single supplier, exactly as Tom mentioned, right? It's going to be the similar thing, right? You got to think about all the ways that they're gaining access, because a single vendor supplying your services, well, if they're compromised, you know, that's the ingress point into your environment, right? So it's making sure that those processes are secured. You know when they're getting access and how. And if you're controlling it, it gives you that control, it gives you that visibility. And exactly as Chris said, it means you're not hooked in, and it's harder to kind of switch and position to a new supplier.
Mm. I think that third-party access route or attack route is quite key as well. There's a number of advanced persistent threats out there that are trying to attack large organizations via their third parties. You know, you use the example of somebody like a major oil and gas client who's spending billions on their cyber defense, but the suppliers to them don't have the same sort of robust budget, shall we say. And so they're a weak link, and a good quality vendor in this space will understand that they're an avenue of attack, and they'll demonstrate to you what it is that they're doing to manage that risk.
Thanks, guys. Is there any more questions?
There's one final one from John. How do we mine the CyberArk logs of access and usage of systems in order to catch misuse?
So if you like, I guess I can take that one. So this is, it sounds relatively straightforward, but it's often not necessarily been implemented. But what we kind of talk about with privileged access management, obviously being biased with CyberArk, is that becomes the way that your admins gain access. So in theory, any administrative access that takes place in your environment, application layer, infrastructure layer, should go through that process. And then what you can do now with the logs of that and your system logs is correlate that into a kind of a threat analytics process, right? To say, well, look, we've just seen a privileged connection over here, but it didn't go through CyberArk, right? That is something we absolutely need to investigate, ideally with some kind of automated remediation, because look, a would-be attacker is not going to MFA into CyberArk, make a formal request for a privileged session and get that and go through them. They're going to try to find ways to circumvent your controls. So those logs help with that, you know, to identify misuse, to identify that circumvention. And, you know, with time that we've got, I'd say that's probably the most straightforward one to consider is once you put the guardrails and the control points in place, you know, you can then do that correlation. It's a bit like I've seen a great meme where there's a security checkpoint, right? And they haven't got fences either side, and it's been snowing, and all you can see is tire tracks just driving around the security checkpoint, right? That's where privileged access can come in. It can make sure that everyone's going through that, and anyone who tries to go around it, well, that's what you alert upon, right? And that's where you bring those logs together.
Yeah, I'd say like with any sort of incident detection and response, whether it's network telemetry or endpoint detection type solutions, it's all about that data enrichment. You need multiple indicators of compromise to identify if you're under attack. So, you know, you can exfiltrate the logs from whatever governing systems you've got, pull them together into a SIM solution, use that data enrichment to really understand, okay, we saw a network breach at 10:57, and we saw a corresponding attempt to access the password vault at 10:58. And we can see that somebody's definitely trying to get the keys to our kingdom. And you combine that with your syslogs from your applications, etc. You can really trace an attack and stop it before it becomes a major issue.
Yeah, you combine that with your IAM system, and then you can look at, you know, who they are and where they are, and what department and what phone number to ring, etc. So, just a word of time, guys. There's no more questions. Tom, is there?
Nothing else in the chat.
Yeah, cool. So, well, I'd just like to thank everybody for responding to the survey. I'd like to obviously thank Tom and David for a great webinar. And if there is anything that you do need, I'd like to talk to us about, then my contact details are on the screen. Please don't hesitate to get in touch. And thank you, everybody, and have a great day.